Welcome everyone to Relab's podcast today. We're going to explore some practical insights for property developers in Auckland. I'm Bridget, I'm from Relab, and today's topic of due diligence can make or break a development project. So if you're evaluating a potential site or navigating Auckland's complex regulatory landscape, the work you do up front can save you significant headaches and cost, and that's why I'm really excited to introduce our special guest today, which is Michael Campbell, joining us from Campbell Brown Planning.
Hi Bridget.
Hey, Michael. So I'll just do a brief introduction for you. We know that you're a very highly respected figure in Auckland's planning and resource management sector. Michael brings over 25 years of experience and is a director of Campbell Brown Planning. What makes Michael's perspective particularly valuable is his experience on both sides of the development process. So he's worked in senior management roles in local government, overseeing resource consent applications, and now advises developers on large-scale projects. So Michael, thank you for joining us today to share your insights on this topic.
Thanks, Bridget.
Cool. So for today, we really want to understand how to evaluate a site's potential and its constraints to make sure that we're making informed decisions that affect the project viability. So with Auckland's unique challenges from flooding concerns to infrastructure capacity issues, changing regulations with Plan Change 78 and 79, and a market that's constantly evolving, the stakes for proper due diligence have never been higher. So Michael, just to kick things off, how do you typically guide developers through those early assessment stages?
Sure, thanks. I guess the first principle we work to is that good base information and having a really good grounding on the overlays and constraints that apply to a particular site is vital. So the first thing we need to focus on when we're looking at sites is kind of this information gathering process. And that's to ensure that we fully understand both the constraints and the opportunities that apply to a site. There's probably a second element that follows that, which is once you've got this information in terms of opportunities and constraints, what does it mean for the site? Is it a fatal flaw? Is it an advantage? Or is it something that there's a solution that can get around the issue? So obviously different sites have different constraints and different opportunities. So I think the important thing is to have in place a process that makes sure, almost like a checklist, and that's certainly what we do for our clients, is we work through a process of accessing the available information and working with that information to glean a fulsome picture of what the site can and can't do, and then really working with our client and their vision in terms of how those constraints and opportunities are going to inform their vision for the site in terms of what they want to achieve.
Yeah. Okay. So if I was a developer, how would you advise me if I come to you with a site?
Sure. So I guess there's a bunch of information that's available. A lot of it's online that we would work through. So the first thing, I'm a planner, so the first thing we want to understand is, well, what is the zoning of the site? So the Auckland Unitary Plan, it's an electronic plan. So the first thing, the most important thing we like to do is work out what is the zoning of the site, because all of the rules that will apply to that site will, to a large degree, fall out of the zoning. And so that's an important issue, is to understand the zoning. And then equally importantly is to understand what are the overlays, the controls and the designations that may or may not apply to a site. And once again, this information is all available on the Auckland Council's website for the Unitary Plan, but it's really critical that you interrogate the zoning, but also the overlays, controls and designations, because some of those overlays and controls and designations can actually have a significant impact on the development potential for a site. So for example, you may have a site that's zoned residential, but it may have a significant ecological area over part or all of it, and that would have a considerable constraint on what you could do with the site. Similarly, the site may be subject to a designation, which may have a land take for road widening. And so once again, when you're acquiring a site, it's vital that you understand what those constraints are and what the implications for your development are. In the case of a road widening designation, it may well be that you can live with that as long as you know that there's going to be some land taken across the front of your site and you reflect that in the purchase price, then that may well be acceptable. But if it's a critical issue in terms of the feasibility of the project and the take is going to mean that you can't achieve the type of development that you want to achieve, then that may have a material consideration on whether or not you want to purchase the site. So I guess our first starting point is always going to be checking the zoning, understanding the rule framework and any particular controls that could either add development, because in some cases there are overlays and controls that actually add development, like additional height overlays, or they potentially take development away. The second document, which is also a council sourced information, is the council's GIS, the Geographical Information System. And that's a vital document in terms of a number of things. The first most important thing from my perspective is ascertaining if the site is subject to any issues relating to flooding or overland flow paths, because issues of flooding and overland flow paths can, in some cases, have a material impact on the development. And so that's a really important aspect when you're looking at a piece of land, is to understand what sort of natural hazards the site may or may not be subject to. Equally of importance is servicing. And so the GIS also indicates, whether or not the site has access to things like water supply, wastewater, or stormwater. Now, I would also caution, though, that just because a site has access and you can see servicing in terms of wastewater or stormwater, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can access the line. There may be capacity issues, and if people are involved in development at the moment, they will be aware, for example, that Watercare have prepared constraint maps of the Auckland region. And so generally for our clients, when we're looking at due diligence for sites and we're wanting to understand the capacity because of engineering, you may need to talk to an engineer, and potentially you may need to reach out to Watercare just to understand if the network has capacity issues. Because once again, it's important not to assume just because you're in an urban area that you will have access to infrastructure. And if you've got a site that you buy and there's constraints, there's downstream constraints on wastewater capacity, that means you can't get connections. Well, that could delay you for months or years. So confirming access to services and confirming natural hazards is a really important aspect in terms of your due diligence process. There are a whole range of other controls or aspects that's worth considering when you are going through your due diligence process. So, for example, Transpower have controls that apply constraints in relation to setbacks for buildings and development near power lines, and those setbacks depend on the voltage of the lines. It's particularly important if you've got power lines that run across the frontage of your property, because that may result in the need to set back the building for health and safety reasons. It can also have implications in terms of the construction of the building and the required scaffolding. So once again, as part of your due diligence, it's important to understand, are there power lines running across the front of the site or running through the site or next to the site? And if there are, what are the implications? Because it can mean you have to set back your development. And in some cases, it could mean that that's the difference between a development that's viable or not viable. There are also aspects relating to ecological constraints, so natural features that may be on the land. They could relate to things like streams or wetlands, and there are controls in both the unitary plan and in the National Environmental Standards that have controls on things like wetlands and streams. And once again, if you have any sense of those features being located on the site, you may need to get an ecologist to assess those features and determine whether or not they are protected. In the case of a natural wetland, in the current legislation, it is a prohibited activity to destroy a natural wetland. And once again, if you buy a piece of land and it's got a wetland on it, and you haven't picked that up and you've paid for the land, that could be a catastrophic impact on your development proposals. One of the other aspects around the planning side of what we do is the unitary plan is also subject to changes. And some of those changes mean that you could get further development potential. And some of those changes could mean that your development could have to be amended to meet the new rules. And so in the Auckland context, there are also Plan Change 78, which is looking to enable greater intensification around centres and corridors and to enable the medium density residential standards. Now, for the most part, those Plan Change 78 rules are not really in effect, and they're in a bit of a holding pattern. And we're still waiting to see what the Auckland Council will do with that. But once again, it's something to be aware of. Similarly, Plan Change 79 is seeking to introduce additional transport provisions, particularly around pedestrian access, lighting, cycle parking requirements. And those potential controls could have implications in terms of how you set up your development, in terms of your bulk and location, your access requirements that could impact on the yield. So a good understanding of Plan Changes 78 and 79 in particular is important at the moment. And these things evolve. We understand that the Auckland Council is currently working on a plan change to deal with additional controls on natural hazards. So once again, when that comes out, that will be something that we as planning advisors would look to when advising clients on land and what it means for their sites.
Yeah. So with the people do need to be aware of the incoming legislation, and in your perspective, what's the impact to developers and the market with those Plan Change 78 and 79?
Well, in terms of Plan Change 78, as a general principle, it's potentially looking to increase the development potential across vast areas of the Auckland urban area. A lot of the Auckland area is being upzoned to enable 3 stories. But I would hasten to add that those controls are certainly in the current environment are up in the air. And we're placing not a great deal of weight on Plan Change 78 at the present time because there is so much uncertainty around whether or not those rules are going to be implemented. So I would caution anyone who's buying a piece of land that's currently zoned, for example, single house or mixed housing suburban. They're buying it on the hope that it gets rezoned to mixed housing urban.
Yeah.
That would be, in the current environment, a risky proposition, in my opinion. Equally, with Plan Change 78, the main implication with that, in my opinion, is the proposed plan change is looking to increase the pedestrian width requirements. What that means is, if you think about a site, a traditional rectangular site, you need a piece of land for your vehicle access, you need a piece of land for your pedestrian access, you need a piece of the land or the site for your outlook, for your amenity, your outdoor living area, and of course you need a building. So it suddenly means things can be a bit tight. And so that's about looking at your site. How wide is the site? Are you going to be able to fit the things in that you need to fit in to get a development that can be consentable?
Yeah. Or it's sacrificing things like car spaces on site.
Well, exactly. And it may well be that that's okay and that's a sacrifice. But if your commercial imperative is to achieve parking on site and to achieve a certain type of unit, you have to weigh that up with the new Plan Change 79 requirements. You have to see if you can fit it into the particular site. And it may be that an 18-metre wide site you can do it, but if you're looking at a 16-metre site, it may suddenly become problematic.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And so just before we carry on with the checklist, we've covered transpower, water care flooding, ecological constraints, and I just want to circle back to flooding. So since the Auckland anniversary floods, have you seen a change in Auckland Council's risk appetite for what's
Uh,
consented or not?
yes, I have, and it's probably understandable
Yeah.
because there were large areas were subject to some pretty extensive flooding. So certainly the council is quite cautious about areas of floodplains, and it's important to remember that as the applicant or the developer, the responsibility on you is on you to demonstrate to the council that you're not going to have some impacts. And in the case of things like flooding, there's kind of two key elements that the council's interested in. One is that your development, when you develop it, that it's not going to be a harm to the health and safety of those inhabitants. So you have finished floor levels need to be higher. You need to be able to ensure that there's potential evacuation routes in times of flood, and sometimes that's going to depend on the extent and the volume of flooding. If it's small, low level flooding, that may not be an issue, but if it's
Mhm.
extensive swathes of deep flooding, that could have significant impacts on whether or not a development's viable. So the health and safety of inhabitants of the dwellings is an important consideration. But the other important consideration is the work that you do on your site, be it building a house or doing earthworks, that has the potential to take up flood storage capacity, which means that the council may well have concerns about the impacts on the upstream and the downstream effects. So if you have a site in a floodplain, that's the type of work that your engineer is going to need to do to
Mhm.
demonstrate to the council that you're not going to have an impact on both the inhabitants of the house and the future impacts on neighbours both upstream and downstream of your site.
Yeah. So the weighting on that would be quite high as one of the
Yeah,
factors.
it is. It's probably a hot issue for council, and it doesn't mean that sometimes there's not solutions, but
Yeah.
it does to my mind raise a flag that
Mm.
if you've got those issues on your site, you need to seek professional advice from an engineer to say, okay, what is the flooding issue? Is it something that is a significant issue? Or is it a minor issue? It could depend on where the site is relative to the catchment. If the site's sitting at the top of the catchment and the floodplain is relatively small and discrete, it may not be an issue. But if it's at the bottom of a catchment and you've got a whole bunch of land above you and it's
Mm.
running through your site, then that suddenly could mean that it's potentially catastrophic to your aspirations for the site.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what else is on your due diligence checklist?
I think there's a couple of things that we always sort of look at. There are other avenues to get information from the council that can be helpful. So we quite often recommend that clients get a land information memorandum, and that's an information document that's prepared by the Auckland Council that basically provides all of the information that the council has about the site. And that can be really useful in terms of understanding, are there any designations proposed or notices of requirement, or has there been any illegal work undertaken on the site, or any enforcement action, or illegal buildings. You know, if you're looking at a site and you've got an existing building, does it have a lawful building consent or a lawful resource consent? And so getting a limb, in my opinion, is important. And quite often, when properties are on the market, generally people who are selling their properties will have got a limb. So the first, rather than going off and getting your own limb, I would probably firstly ask the vendor through their agent to say, "Have you got a limb?" Get a
Hmm.
copy. Check that the limb's reasonably new. You don't want to be working off a limb that's 1 year old. So check that it's probably, I'd say, no older than 3 months, because things can change, sites can evolve. So I think that's a really important step to do. You can also, if you want, obtain a copy of the council property file. And that can be ordered online. And I think they have two steps. There's a longer step that takes 10 days, and I think an urgent one is 3 working days. And that's a really useful document if you want to see if there's any additional information on a site that the council may hold. And sometimes there could be old geotech reports that are helpful, copies of previous consents, just general information, particularly if you're wanting to understand the planning or building history of a site. Getting the property file is also an important step. I think the cost is about $100, so it's not a big cost. And we quite often, for our clients, will get the property file and just look at it and just make sure that there's nothing there that is untoward. It's particularly important if you've got an existing development and you want to satisfy yourself that the existing development has been lawfully established. And sometimes what you may perceive is what you see on the site and you think, oh, this is all great and the use is great and it's been operating for 10 years. And what the council perceives is happening can be different. And we sometimes have these moments where people buy sites thinking it's all legitimate. They come in and lodge a consent for something else and suddenly find that the existing uses that they had were never lawfully established. So that's really important, is just what is the current lawful basis for the site.
What's the impact to them if the current use is not lawfully established?
Well, they take on that responsibility. They may have civil redress to the person, but in the eyes of the council, if there's something that the council says, hey, you know, there's an illegal building on the site, it was never lawfully established, you're the new owner, you're the person that has to remedy it. You may have civil redress, but ultimately in the eyes of the council, you're the owner, you're the person that has to fix it. The other important step is to obtain a copy of the certificate of title, and most people going through their due diligence would do that. It's pretty self-evident, and you would probably get your lawyer to check that title. The important thing about the title is just to understand that what you think you're getting is what you're getting, and don't necessarily assume that fences demark the actual curtilage of a property. So it's a good check when, you know, most titles will have the layout and they'll have some dimensions. It's good to just make sure that what you think you're buying is what you're getting. And if you can, you know, when you go on site, you can see survey pegs, the better. It's also important to see if there are any interests on the title, and you can obtain the interests and the title from online from LINS. Now, interests could range in all sorts of things. They could be private covenants that have obligations on you. An example of a private covenant that's quite common in more recent subdivisions, for example, might be that you can't put a relocated building on the site. And they quite often, developers of subdivisions will do that because they don't want people to truck on what they may perceive to be an old building onto a site. And to keep their perception of the tone of the subdivision, they want new buildings so that people are buying into a new subdivision. So that could be an example of a civil constraint, that if you've bought a site and you've got an express desire to relocate a villa from Remuera, that could be a problem. There could be other constraints on titles that relate to councils. They could be things like geotechnical constraints. When the subdivision was originally done, maybe the council imposed a requirement on certain things, certain geotechnical work to be done. There could be things like setbacks. There could be, you know, restrictions on the number of units and things. There's a whole range. So the important thing, I guess, is to obtain the title and satisfy yourself that you're buying what you think you're getting, but also to get the interests. And generally, your lawyer should be able to take you through that, or a planner can also help if it's something to do with planning. But really important that you have a clear understanding on what you're purchasing and what those interests are. A couple of other things that are really important, in my opinion, is if you're buying a site, it's also good to understand what's happening around your site. That could be for various reasons. Firstly, if you're buying a site next to a town centre, you need to understand that if there's a commercial zone next door, that could have implications in terms of what they could do. If you're buying next door to an industrial area, that could have implications for what they're doing. So having an understanding of what you're zoning, but what your neighbour's zoning is really important. We often get people, you know, maybe you've bought a piece of land that's zoned low density and you think, great, I'm buying into a nice character area, but you didn't realise that there was a high density zone along your western boundary that enables 5 stories. You're going to be pretty disappointed if you suddenly realise that, no, you can't do anything on your land, but your neighbour can build 5 stories. So understanding what can happen around you is important. And also a couple of things that are really important around your streetscape is if you're thinking you need access into your site, if you're changing your access, street trees are protected and they are owned by parks. And I can't underestimate the importance of satisfying yourself that if there is a street tree outside your property, you need to consider the implications, because the Parks Department are very strict about removal of trees. And what you may think is a relatively innocuous tree, the Parks Department may not agree with you and may say, no, that tree cannot be removed. And once again, if access to your site is contingent on removing a tree, then that could have significant implications for your development. And we have noted in the last few months that the Parks Department are particularly concerned about tree removals. And so you need to be very wary. You'd probably be best advised to engage an arborist to give you some advice on whether or not the removal is going to be viable, because once again, it can be quite catastrophic if parks say no, because parks are a tree owner. So even getting a resource consent to remove a tree is not sufficient. If parks own the tree, like any other landowner, if they say, no, you can't remove the tree, you don't have any appeal rights generally. So it can really be catastrophic to a development. Similarly, I think it's important when you're looking at your street, are there any things that could prevent development or that you need to be aware of? Is there a bus stop? Is there no parking lines? Or are you close to an intersection, which might mean access is tricky? So it's once again, it's just thinking about what are those potential red flags that if you need to get access or change your access to a site outside what you already have, you may need to think about that.
And this kind of ties back to what you were saying with Transpower as well, right? With the power lines.
Yeah, exactly. It's just understanding the context of the site, because those things could even be outside the resource consent team's control. I mean, you can get a resource consent to build a building, but if Transpower says, no, you're too far away, then they've got their own legislation that can prevent you from doing it. So you don't want to go down a rabbit hole of getting a consent that you can't actually implement.
Yeah. So we're talking about what happens just outside your boundary that could impact your development.
That's right. Yeah.
If you suspect that a neighbour has got a consent for a development, what would you advise?
Well, once a resource consent has been lodged with the council, that is public information. So you can contact the council and inquire as to whether or not a resource consent has been granted for your adjoining site. Yeah. And you can obtain a copy. There may be a copying charge, and you may have to request it under the Local Government Official Information Act if need be. But generally speaking, apart from a few very minor exceptions, a resource consent is public information once it has been lodged.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you can actually see it on Relab now. A little pop up. Would you go as far as, if someone's on Relab and they see that, would you go as far as advising them to order a property file to get the full information?
Absolutely. Look, if you've got an indication that someone's building a house or some development next door to you and you want to understand what it means for you, then absolutely you could reach out to the council, obtain a copy of the property file, because it may well be that the way they've designed it has some implications for how you might deal with your site, either purchasing, developing it in the future, or even in terms of just you've got a site and you want to understand what the impacts on the amenity. If you've bought a site, it's just a one-off site where you've got you want to have a nice backyard, and you find out that there's 10 units running along your western boundary, that may have an implication as to whether or not you're prepared to purchase the site. Yeah.
Just in terms of your feasibility as opposed to what can actually be done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And potentially, the amenity for your future residents.
Yeah.
The other thing, and I did touch on this around the ecology, but the other thing to be aware of is if you're on the coast, or if you have a stream wider than 3 metres, there are Esplanade Reserve requirements, and that's basically a requirement that you need to vest 20 metres from the edge of the stream or the coastal marine zone, or coastal edge, 20 metres, and that vests in the council without compensation. So once again, if you've got this piece of land and you think it's amazing and it's got a wonderful stream through it and you think that's great, just be aware that if that stream is wider than 3 metres, and as surveyors can calculate what constitutes a 3-metre stream, then you will have to vest the 20 metres on either side of the stream in the council without compensation. And once again, if that's a big factor in your development due diligence, you need to be aware of that when you're factoring what price you might be prepared for a piece of land.
That's pretty significant contribution.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is the topography of the land. If you've got a steep site, there may be some stability matters. And once again, there's probably an engineering solution, but if your site's reasonably steep, you may need specific engineering design. So just be mindful of steep sites. And there are some areas in Auckland that have stability overlays, which are not particularly easy to get from the council, but Meadowbank, around the Meadowbank coastal area, is a case in point where the council have maps that say that they're stability sensitive, and so they're going to require a geotechnical report. For most developments, you're going to need a geotechnical report anyway, but it's just one thing to be aware when you've got steep land, there are engineering issues that you'll have to consider. The other thing which I think is really important as part of your due diligence is to understand what development contributions you may need to pay. So a development contribution is a contribution that's levied on new development, and that's generally levied to pay for infrastructure and the costs of growth. So examples of what development contributions contribute to are things like trunk infrastructure for stormwater, infrastructure for roading in terms of public transport contributions, in terms of regional roading upgrades, things like libraries, community facilities, parks. So all of those things are, as we increase our population, as we provide more housing, then the council levies a development contribution. The council has a development contribution estimator, but they are currently going through a development contribution review. And in some cases, the development contributions in certain areas are increasing by a significant margin. In some cases, $80,000 increases in some of the growth areas like Mount Roskill, Whenuapai, Red Hills, and in Tamaki. So once again, that's really important that when you do your due diligence, you understand what the development contributions will be payable for the site. Typically, you will pay a development contribution for each new dwelling you add. You'll probably get a credit for any existing dwelling. So if you buy a site with one house on it, you'll get one credit because you've got an existing house. But if you add any more houses, then you will pay a development contribution for each additional house. The development contributions slightly reduce if you go to higher density or smaller houses. So they tend to charge the full DC on a larger single house, whereas for terrace housing and apartments, it does reduce slightly. But make no mistake, the development contributions per unit are not insignificant. And I think on average with the new policy, they're increasing to averaging around $30,000 per unit. And in some cases, in some areas, those development contributions are considerably more. So as part of your due diligence, understanding what the existing development contributions are and understanding what the new proposed development contributions will be, which I believe there's a decision due to be made at the end of this month, is a really important consideration when looking at your acquisition of a site. Similarly, there is also what's called an infrastructure growth charge, which is levied by Watercare for the wastewater component of infrastructure. So please don't ignore the fact that you've got both a development contribution payable and an infrastructure growth charge. I think presently the IGC is something around $18,000 plus GST. So it's feasible that for most developments for new dwellings, you're around the $50,000 for contributions for each new dwelling. But I'd hasten to add that it's different for different areas depending on the requirements for growth. Some areas have had a lot of infrastructure done and it's all paid for, and other areas are requiring more work. And so it's going to depend on the area.
So where can developers find the infrastructure growth charge?
That's generally available on the Watercare's website, so they
Okay.
can have a look at that.
Yeah.
You can Google DC estimator at the Auckland Council, and that will tell you an estimate, provide you with an estimate of the existing DC policy, but it won't tell you the current, the proposed DC policy. There is a website that talks about the new policy, and the draft policy is available, but it is a bit of a dark art in terms of calculating what those implications are, and we often are helping our clients trying to estimate what the new DCs will be.
Yeah.
I would imagine that following the end of this month, assuming that the policy is endorsed, then they will update the DC estimator.
Yeah. So who do you think will ultimately bear the cost of the new development contribution charges?
Well, look, ultimately, from my perspective, it's the future house purchasers.
Yeah.
You have a certain thing as a developer looking to build a site. They have the value of the land. They have what it's going to cost them to build the building. They have all of their professional fees in terms of people like me and surveyors and architects and whatnot. Then they have the development contributions, and they need to make a margin, because why would you develop a piece of land if you're not making a margin? So ultimately, from my perspective, that cost will be loaded onto the purchase price. Or it may be a point where a developer, someone's looking at the site and they do their numbers and they look at all of the controls and they look at the DCs and they come up to the conclusion this doesn't stack up, and they walk away from it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So pre-development, it's almost off the land price.
Well, it's certainly something you'll consider when you're looking at your land and you're looking at what you're prepared to pay. That's probably the only thing you can control. It's pretty difficult to control the build price, pretty difficult to sort of have a big control on the sale price, to my mind. The DC's fixed, so that's going to have an implication on potentially what you might be prepared to pay for the site.
Yeah.
So that's probably the main, aspects that we would cover off when we're looking at a site. I should say there's probably a couple of other things to be aware of, actually. One is contamination. Once again, there are certain areas, and a case in point is, say, example, out Western Waitakere, because of a lot of Waitakere was formerly orchards. The council generally has a layer that says that basically that's potentially contaminated land. There's a good resource on the council's GIS where you can get the historic aerial photographs, and it's worth checking the historic aerial photographs to see if there were any orchards on the land around, and on the sort of, I think you can go back to 1956 and you can have a look. And if there were orchards on the site, then probably chances are you're going to need a contamination report. If you've got a site that was maybe used for industrial activities, petrol stations, or even sort of mechanics and things like that, then chances are you're going to need a contamination report. And possibly the only other thing to be mindful of is there are obligations under the New Zealand Heritage Act in terms of sites, and any site, as I understand it, is that has had human occupation for more than 100 years is potentially a site that could be a flag for heritage. So you need to think about those sites, and even thinking about when you walk on the site, are there any potential features, particularly around the coast? The coastal areas are associated with habitation for mana whenua, and so if you've got things like midden, you need to be aware of. There could be little shell deposits that could be representative of some former habitation. So once again, it's just kind of being aware of those things, and there is a layer in the GIS that provides some information on known archaeological sites, but there are sites that are protected by Heritage New Zealand that are not included in the unitary plan. So once again, it's just being aware of that potential for heritage sites.
Yeah. So we've covered off a really detailed checklist of what to do for due diligence. If you had to zoom out and you put yourself in the developer's shoes, what would you trigger first, or who would you get involved to help you go through these?
Well, look, it's probably no surprise. I'd say, as a planner, we think we're well placed to
Yeah.
advise clients on these things. We know where to look, and we kind of know how to interpret the provisions to a degree. I mean, there's technical things like engineering we potentially can't help with, but so I think it starts with a good, like I said at the start, it starts with good base knowledge. As long as you've got a really good understanding on what are the overlays that apply to a site, then it's around the analysis of what does it mean for the site. And that's where a planner can help you. I think for larger projects, you're well advised to seek advice from an engineer, particularly around the servicing and the flooding issues. Quite often, if our clients will also talk to an architect and potentially look and prepare a Balkan location, because you kind of want to see, okay, I've got the zoning, I know what I can do generally, but I've got this plan change 79 that I need certain access requirements. I need to do a Balkan location that I can actually show how I can get the houses in, how I can make sure that the height in relation to boundary controls work, for example, get the access to the site, get the dwelling, get the outlook. And so quite often with larger projects in particular, we'll work with the client and the architect and perhaps an engineer as part of the due diligence, because yeah, I appreciate that's a bit of money up front, but there's nothing more catastrophic than you've bought a piece of land and you're not able to do what you purchased it for a whole range of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so critical to make those informed decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to use your expertise, so we've got due diligence, but also a big part of due diligence is your feasibility and making sure that what you build will be able to sell. And there's been
Yeah.
quite a lot of discussion around an oversaturation of apartments and difficult to sell certain quality. What is your opinion in terms of how developers should design their apartments?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we don't, as planners, we're not in the business of really advocating one typology or another in terms of the market. But what I would say is, what I say to clients is, have a look in your area, have a look at what's being built around you. And that's probably a reasonable indication. If people are building 2-bedroom apartments, maybe that's what's selling. Have a chat to the local agents in your area. What are they selling? What are people, have you got families who are looking for 3-bedroom homes, or have you got people wanting 4-bedroom homes, or have you got, single people just wanting 2-bedroom homes? And so understanding your local demographic of the area that you're in, what's selling, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's just considering if things aren't selling, is that an argument to build a better quality apartment at a higher yield?
Yeah, but also I think we are at a period now where there is probably a surplus of housing, and
Yeah.
certainly our clients, I think, we like to think they work at the higher end space, and
Yeah.
I think the market's probably more discerning. And the one thing I will say to people when we talk to them about being, if people are on the development journey, or there is the project you do today, and how well you do it, that's your advertisement for your project tomorrow. So if you do a good job, if it sells well, if you've got a good attention to quality, and that's the something that you can go to the council with in the future and say, hey, look, this is what I've developed. It's good quality. It's been well received by the market. That's going to put you in good stead. I think if you're serious about being a developer, I think it's a really good strategy to really think about what's the type of market you're going to aim for. And I think ultimately the council will look kindly on you, or kinder on you, if they see that the products that you're delivering to the market is a good quality.
Yeah. So it makes you more sustainable in the long term for
Yeah,
every
I
future
think you've got to
consent.
take. I think you've absolutely reputationally you've got to take a long-term view. I mean, you can say, yeah, great, I got through this development and I managed to screw the last dollar out of it, and you know, yeah, great. But if it looks terrible and it's not adding to the street, and the council sees it and knows that, hey, this isn't a great outcome. And look, I think that Auckland is growing and there's some wonderful examples of intensification, but there's some less desirable examples. And I'm just simply making the point that the council is acutely aware of some developments that are not good quality. And if they get a sense that you're delivering a development that's not of a good quality, your life is going to be challenging. And you're going to find it's going to be harder than normal. And so if you're delivering good product, look, you're not going to get a free rein. It's not going to be without challenges, but at least you can stand by your product, and you know that the market wants it. You know you've got a good attention to quality. I think it'll put you in good stead.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for such a thorough and practical list of things to watch out for. So what I'm going to do at the end of this is I'll share all the links that you've shared with us, but how do people get in touch with you and Campbell Brown Planning if they do want to get some specific planning advice?
Yeah, they can Google Campbell Brown Planning. We've got a website, and I think our emails are available. And yeah, people are welcome to
Yeah.
give me a call.
Oh, thank you so much.
Right,
It's been
thanks, Bridget.
great.
And yeah, nice, and yeah, hopefully that's given some people some food for thought.
Yeah, of course. It's been really valuable.